This is Window on the East, a podcast from BNE IntelliNews. Subscribe at bne.eu.
Hi, welcome to another webcast with me, being Ben Aris, the editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. I'm very excited today. I'm joined by a very old friend of mine, Owen Matthews, who's a journalist, former bureau chief of Newsweek in Moscow, and a regular contributor to Spectator. He's just written a new book called Overreach: The Inside Story of Putin and Russia's War Against Ukraine. So we're going to talk about that. I mean, he has some interesting things to say. Owen's one of the most well-informed and well-connected people I know who does Russia. We met in the legendary newsroom of the Moscow Times on Ulica Pravdy, the Street of Truth, so aptly named, when we were both beginning our careers way back in the day when we were young. Owen, very nice to see you. Welcome. So you've just brought out this book, Overreach, where you did a deep dive into the whole cause of the war, and Telegraph called it a sensation. I mean, it's a very serious book where you looked into the antecedents to it and think about how we got there in the first place. And I think you could sum the book up as, like, it starts with, there's a mystery. Why did Putin do this? This is insane. I mean, Russia's taken on and started a war in the 21st century that we had no idea was coming and caught everybody out. I mean, I think myself, you included, that no one thought he would actually cross the border and go to war against Ukraine and try and conquer it. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's going to be lots of fantastic books. They've started coming out already about, the story of the war and Ukraine's fantastic resistance and so on. But and that's all important, but it doesn't answer the central mystery, as you rightly say. Is the real story is actually in Russia, in the Kremlin, and in Putin's mind, what was going through his mind. And indeed, just like you, I never said the war was never going to happen, but I doubted that it was going to happen for three really simple reasons. One of them is that Putin was actually doing incredibly well with his diplomacy, like his gigantic saber rattling, and the plausibility of that military buildup, from October through, starting in sort of September of 2021, building up to the invasion, because everyone was so scared and it was so plausible, and the operational details were all, so lavish, and it looked so much like an invasion. 3 days before Putin presses the button, he has a conversation with Emmanuel Macron, which Macron's team, they're high-fiving each other. There's some very good reporting in Le Monde about this. They think, like, great, we finally got a breakthrough, because they're talking about a summit between Putin and Biden with, the Germans and the French, talking to discuss, the quote-unquote security architecture of Europe. That's a pretty great thing for Putin to have achieved just through a gigantic bluff. So that's the first reason I didn't think that there was any sense to it. Second, there was no preparation for it.
Let's go through all three, but I just wanted to inject there. I mean, that I saw that as well, that Putin in 2008, Medvedev went to Brussels when he took over as president with a new security deal for Europe. And it just got laughed at. I mean, I actually had a friend who was in the meeting, and it just got thrown into the bin. They didn't even look at it. And to put the security agenda on the table the way he did, by threatening, by putting troops on the border with Ukraine twice, was already a huge gain. And the way I read it, you had two rounds, first with the Americans in January, and then a second round with the French, where they tried to resuscitate the Minsk II. And that was going very well. But all of this threats was just to get this diplomacy going, which he did get going, although the key demand, which was Ukraine shall never join NATO, that was refused by the Americans, Bilkin in particular. And that was the key issue for him at that point. And when that failed, when it became clear it failed, then he pushed the button and crossed the border at the end of February. However, I was thinking at that point he would do something like, hit an airfield or, put some nukes into Kaliningrad or something like that. But to actually go as far as full invasion of Ukraine, I think, was a shock to everybody. But do you agree with that? I mean, it was very good diplomacy, but it looked like sort of aggressive, but nevertheless diplomacy.
Well, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not convinced. I mean, I don't think the Americans were particularly convinced, because I mean, there's been some fantastic, very senior level reporting in the Washington Post, talking to all the principals who were in the room in January and February, because there were several rounds of talks between Lavrov and Blinken, and the Americans said that they thought the Russians were quote unquote performing diplomacy rather than actually doing it. But I mean, concerning NATO, it's worth unpacking what you just said, because that's actually really important. Is you suggested the Americans were actually, were against ruling out NATO's Ukrainian membership for NATO. I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because actually already, in the run up to the war, and actually literally on the eve of the invasion, Zelensky publicly said that actually, he's basically was willing to walk away from full membership if there were security guarantees. So it wasn't even an absolute demand by the Ukrainians, actually. And I think that, the high point of Putin's diplomacy was literally like the day before he launched his war. He launches his war and loses everything. But people tend to forget that actually Viktor Yanukovych, who's often described as like the pro-Moscow president that was deposed in the Maidan revolution in February of 2014, although he actually had some serious problems and disputes with the Kremlin. But anyway, Yanukovych, when he came to power, actually codified, he passed a law that Ukraine would not join NATO, but remain non-aligned, and that law even actually was still on the statute books after the Maidan revolution, and actually was only repealed in October of 2014. So for like a 5-year period, Ukraine had literally like codified in law its non-membership of NATO. So it's not really a huge problem. The problem is that the issue was that, of course, Putin, it was not enough for Putin that Ukraine literally had a law they were not going to join NATO. He wanted more, and that's why he pushed for Ukraine to join the Russian customs union rather than the EU association agreement. And this is all ancient history, but it's important because now all this stuff that like NATO's inexorable expansion is often cited by the Kremlin and pro-Kremlin voices as this sort of juggernaut that's moving towards inevitable membership. But that's actually just factually not true.
Let's delve into NATO a bit more in a moment. I mean, I interrupted you. You were going through the mystery and 3 points. You'd made one of them. What were the other two?
Well, I mean, the reasons why I didn't think he was going to invade. The second two are very simple. Is that there was no real public preparation, and I actually, having knowing as I do lots of journalists and editors and producers, and even like the heads of some Russian channels, for me that was the real bellwether, or I thought it was the bellwether. Is that there was obviously the usual sort of hysterical noise about fascists in Kiev and so on, but there was actually no full-scale preparation of the Russian people for a full invasion, which I thought, basically meant that took that to be proof that the Kremlin was bluffing. Instead, actually, it was proof that the Kremlin kept its plans even from senior members of the Security Council until the very last minute. But the third reason I didn't think it was going to happen was that actually simply that that Russia had too much to lose. And when I'm sure we're going to be talking about this in more length, but I mean the logic of Gerhard Schröder and then Angela Merkel in forming this very deep energy relationship dependency, which has been so strongly criticized, the whole Germany's whole relationship with Gazprom, for years. Obviously created a dependency by Germany on Russian gas, but it also created a dependency in Russia on German money. And in a logical world where you're dealing with rational players, that is an enormous thing to lose. Your economy strongly depends on having a good relationship with Europe and the Europeans buying your gas. That actually should be a stabilizing factor. It wasn't, so I think in that sense, Schroeder has had a bit of a bad rap, actually, because the logic is not flawed. The mutual dependency tends to create a strong disincentive to disrupt that relationship, except in one case, which turned out to be the case, and that is you're dealing with an essentially irrational actor, or someone that actually prioritizes security over prosperity, as he sees it.
I think that's key, security over prosperity. And that, well, we'll come back to the minute. Another, in the preamble, key point is that we were shocked, and I was shocked particularly at the size of the invasion. I mean, if it was me, I was thinking the way to do it was that you just swap out you admit you've got regular troops in Donbass, because they were there, but they were there secretly. It was normally a separatist fight. And you then take Donbass, and this is also a guarantee against NATO, because NATO rules are such that you cannot join NATO if you have a disputed border. And Ukraine already has Crimea's disputed border. So even if it wanted to join NATO, it can't because of that. And then taking the Donbass, more of the same. But the key is that he would go for full invasion and just think that he can walk into Kiev. And I got that one wrong, because I just couldn't see, a force of 40,000 Russian men walking into Kiev and taking it. And so I discounted that from the beginning. I was just like, not an option. But it seems that and I've been corrected in the meantime, admit that it does seem like that was the plan. And I can't believe that the Kremlin was so badly informed on the mood of the people and the military possibilities of doing something like that, and that this was an enormous mistake. I mean, Russia had been at war with Ukraine for 8 years already, and they knew that the army had been modified and modernized. In 2014, they would have walked to Kiev in a week easily. But all of the investment that's gone in, and the training and the fighting that's been going on in Donbass over the interceding 8 years, meant that it was going to be a serious fight. And I can't understand how Putin could have been, badly informed, or that he'd lost touch. I think you're suggesting in a book that living in the COVID bubble, that might have been decisive in leading him down this path where he thought he could get away with it. What do you think the thinking was?
It's the COVID bubble accentuated the information bubble in which he found himself, had been for many years. The key thing, many people have accused Putin of being, sort of insane, or, being completely crazy. But actually, I think that the truth is that he's just very badly informed. And in a totalitarian system, all of the groupthink and telling the boss that he's right, instincts of Russian bureaucracy just sort of become calcified. So in fact, and in fact, even democracies are not immune to that, because if you look at Bob Woodward's book Plan of Attack, where he sort of very carefully reconstructs and the events leading up to the Iraq invasion of 2003, you see that, intelligence services have a tendency, even in democracies, to tell their bosses what they want to hear. And that's, of course, true a million times over within the FSB. So, what you have is actually sort of, a pyramid of disinformation, which every level is not just incentivized career-wise, but incentivized because they're all stealing to actually tell their bosses. So, and the chain of command is, Putin, asks his foreign intelligence chief, Sergei Naryshkin, or the head of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, particularly, how's it going? Have we succeeded in bribing, suborning, recruiting all of the Ukrainian military, political, and intelligence community? And Bortnikov, calls his main man, Colonel General Sergei Beseda, who's been running the subversion operations. He has his own department in the FSB, specifically devoted to undermining the Ukrainians. And, Beseda is handing out bribes right, left and center. His people are. So he calls his station chief in Ukraine, in Kiev, everyone is telling their boss that they have recruited this source and that source, and they're all telling them great things, and can I have another $500,000, and the amounts of money, we don't know how much they were being handed out, but one of the deputy heads of the Ukrainian security service, the SBU, certainly was he a deputy head or a regional head? Anyway, but a senior Ukrainian intelligence official is caught in Belgrade with 75 million in cash, $75 million in cash. So they're clearly handing out a gigantic amount of money, is going down and leaking at every level, and upwards is going information that everything is going according to plan. You need to buy something for your money. So there's just a very sort of practical reason why he is being lied to, because all the people down the chain have a vested interest, career-wise and materially, to lie.
So what do you think his miscalculations were? I mean, because Kherson, that worked. I mean, it seemed very clear that that was given to the Russians the day they walked in, right at the beginning, a regional capital, an important one, but the only one. And one assumes that the FSB were bribing all the other regional governors where they could. And it didn't work. But so that was one miscalculation. The intel, the operation to subvert didn't work. What else was there?
Well, on a fundamental strategic level, the mistake is actually sort of somewhat understandable. I mean, it remains a mistake, but qualitatively, his mistake was to assume that the future was going to be like the past. Which is, by the way, what every single human being does, and it's the basis of all the planning and logic. You just assume that what happened in the past will happen in the future. Except that he didn't realize how seriously things have changed. And a really good practical example is, in the summer in July of 2014, the Ukrainian army encounters Russian regulars in the field. It's in August 2014 at Ilovayevsk, and they get completely destroyed. And then again the following summer, in July of 2015, there's another disaster for the Ukrainian army at Debaltseve, where again so the two times that Ukrainians and Russian armored troops or motorized infantry have actually clashed in the field, the Ukrainians have lost massively to the Russians. And as you rightly said, the Russians didn't understand the extent to which Ukrainian army had actually, been sort of forged in fire over the subsequent 8 years, and actually, had very good NATO advice and had changed its command structure and all these things that actually contributed to their successful resistance in February, March of 2022. But and another example is Putin's massive miscalculation about how the Europeans and NATO would react. It's not irrational for him to think that the Europeans value their cheap gas over their principles, because that's precisely what Angela Merkel did. Like in February of 2014, Angela Merkel is going around saying, this is, this cannot stand. The annexation of Crimea is an outrage against the rule of law. And then, 14 months later, she's literally sitting down with Gazprom in defiance of the Americans, by the way, who are warning about gas dependence, and signing a $10 billion gas supply deal for Nord Stream 2 with Gazprom. So the Russians are not crazy to assume that the Germans are just total hypocrites and their words are written in water and it's all blah blah. That actually that they will actually be equally indifferent and equally cynical when he tries to take the whole country. But again, this time is different.
Do you think there was also an element that the Russians complained that Maidan was American-backed plot, and you had Newland on the square handing out cookies, and you had what's his face, the senator, fly in and give speeches from the stage, and that they organized that. And if the Americans can do it, why can't we? Because at the same time, the support for the West, Ukraine is very divided, and in the West, of course, with the nationalists of Poland, or the Polish parts of the country are very pro-Europe, but then in the East, that is it was very pro-Russian. I mean, Russophiles, Kharkiv is Russian-speaking city, and the Russians thought that we could play the same game, because at the end of the day, you just throw some money around, and that's possible to do, like the Americans did.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, if that is your belief that the Americans could organize a coup in Kiev, why can't the Russians do it? Because there's much closer, better connected, and willing to devote many more resources to it. Yes, that was another major fallacy. And there's actually part of an even bigger fallacy, and that was, as you rightly said, like a little bit earlier in our conversation, if Putin had tried to pull this, had done this in the spring of 2014, when Ukraine was in chaos, they had an interim government between February and May of 2014. Their country was deeply split, and I visited eastern Ukraine, including Donbass, by the way, in the summer, and there was very strong pro-Russian feeling in Dnipro, in Kharkiv, certainly in Donbass, in Donetsk itself, and Lugansk. If Putin had actually marched in then, I think he actually had a very strong chance of succeeding. But what he didn't realize, I think, was actually the extent to which Ukrainian sort of nationhood or national sovereignty, unity, whatever you like to call it, had actually strengthened over those 8 years. And actually Ukraine became a very different country. And
surely, I mean, this is one of Putin's big mistakes, is that he's actually created the sense of identity of, Ukrainian national identity that was never there before. I mean, before everyone was slightly confused about we're sort of Russian speaking world, and Ukraine as a country didn't really exist any time in history as a country, and now it really very much does, and that's why we're seeing the Ukrainians fight so hard against Russia, and they're just now more and more that there's this feeling of Ukrainian identity, which was exactly what Putin didn't want to create. No.
Well, but Putin, I mean, it would be tragic. I mean, it's sort of tragic in the Greek sense, is that your hero in this case, or in this case, anti-hero, is literally the author of his own downfall. His actions cause the things that he fears that are the sum of all his fears. So it's not just like in creating a sort of strong Ukraine with a very strongly united and pro-Russian, pro-European, anti-Russian, national consciousness. But he's also united NATO. He's given this sort of frankly flagging institution that nobody in Europe was really interested in, new purpose, new members. He's actually alienated. He's sort of destroyed his one major strategic lever, which was the energy dependence in Europe. He's literally caused every bad thing to happen that he went to war to prevent.
Yeah, and ironically, I mean, at Davos yesterday, Kissinger was speaking, and he changed his position. He was arguing pragmatic, realpolitik, that we should concede that Russia's a major power, and that fait accompli, that they've grabbed this sort of bottom corner of Ukraine and they're going to keep it, and just do a peace deal to stop this getting worse. But yesterday he said, look, things have gone too far, no peace deal is possible. And so at this point, why don't we just put Ukraine into NATO and take our chances with Russia and its nukes, which is a pretty radical change. I mean, so it looks like now, the arguments people are making to put Ukraine into NATO, which has always been, for me anyway, the motivation Putin's doing this is to prevent that from ever happening, could well happen now. So it's turning into a complete disaster, isn't it?
Yeah, that's certainly true. And it's interesting that Kissinger, I mean, the Kissinger position is interesting because it's based on the Putin regime actually having some sort of rational calculation of cost and benefit. And that, in other words, that actually there was an argument at a certain point of the war to actually, amputate Donbass, for instance. And in fact, I had several very interesting conversations with Vadim Pristaiko, who is Zelensky's first foreign minister. And he was fired in 2000. He's now ambassador in London, and he was fired in 2019 for saying, basically, Donbass is a gangrenous limb. We need to amputate it, and Ukraine will be a much better country without it, and just sort of, and continue on our Western course, build a bit, and just let it go. And I think actually Zelensky was certainly willing to contemplate letting Crimea go, not the Donbass, but Crimea. So all of these sort of practical considerations of sort of land for peace were very quickly destroyed by Russian brutality. So Bucha was a major inflection point. I mean, even for Zelensky personally, I mean, speaking to people that were around him, I mean, when the Russians withdrew from around Kiev and the Bucha massacres were discovered, Zelensky, if you see his face as he's going around Bucha, I mean, even his whole manner changed. He aged. There were certain inflection points during the war at which actually any kind of compromise with Russia became less and less and less likely. I think the this week's horrific missile attack in Dnipro is another one of them. So unfortunately, it actually makes things more difficult for Ukraine and for the world, frankly, because there is even all these debates that Kissinger initiated about whether it's wise to let Russia retain Crimea or part of Donbass or whatever, now becomes moot because everyone in the West is shifting towards total defeat of Russia and pushback to Ukrainian borders of 1991. But the problem is, I don't think that's actually militarily achievable, frankly.
Well, this is, I think, behind the talk of the tanks. I mean, because all the weapons we've sent so far are largely defensive. We're talking about air defense, SAMs, Patriots. And now the talk of tanks, which are offensive weapons. I mean, Zelensky in his speech to Davos yesterday was saying, what is it? Tyranny is ahead of democracy, that in other words, the Russians are winning, and that he specifically called for tanks, which are an offensive weapon, which the West has been reluctant to provide. And at Ramstein tomorrow, that it could be that Scholz actually concedes and sends some tanks because he's under so much pressure. And then that would change things on the battlefield if tanks are sent in sufficient numbers, which I'm pretty sure they won't be, because the two sides, as you say, are hardening. But you made a point as well about the Russian side hardening, because there was peace talks in March, April that actually came quite close. And I remember watching the Ukrainian side saying, okay, look, we concede, we will abandon NATO, we'll take that clause that Poroshenko put in the constitution about it being a national ambition to join. And we'll go back to neutrality. We accept, individual security guarantees. But then on the Russian side, the liberals, the people that have been running the country and reforming it, and people like Guriev, the economist who made this very radical, very free market plan, who'd been driven out of the country. Now Putin's surrounded by Patrushev, Bodnikov, all of those liberals have disappeared. And so he's also hardened. I mean, to what extent are these guys? They've always wanted this. They don't care about prosperity. You said before that it's about security versus prosperity. And the liberal guys wanted the prosperity, but now you're just left with the guys who want security. And surely that's a Soviet mentality where the people sacrifice their creature comforts, as long as you have security. So you put the money into weapons and planes and missiles. Isn't that where we are? Isn't this the Soviet bit of Putin?
I think that's 100% right, and I often say that the war happened as a result of a KGB takeover of the Kremlin, and I'm not misspeaking. I don't mean FSB. I mean really KGB, because these people have known each other. It's sort of extraordinary, actually, in human, certainly in professional, and definitely in government terms, that a ruling elite have been friends and colleagues for over half a century. I mean, it's nearly half a century. It's crazy. These people have been, known each other since the mid 1970s. And the institution that raised them all was the Soviet era KGB. So the point is that, as one of my sources told me in Moscow, and he's known Putin, he's worked with Putin for 20 years. The war is going badly by all kinds of objective criteria, but actually it's not going badly by the one criteria that the Siloviki, the men of power, actually really care about. Because a Russia that is essentially sort of a war economy under siege from the collective West is the kind of Russia that they want. It's the kind of Russia which needs Siloviki. They have actually sort of created a world within Russia where all of the temptations to be disloyal, to be pro-Western, to be liberal, in other words, all the material temptations that have been stalking the Russian elite, the yachts and the offshore bank accounts and the free travel and all this stuff, and and even going down to the middle class, consumer culture and so on. All that undermines the kind of security state that the Siloviki are trying to create. So actually, the real paradox is that actually what's bad for Russia is actually good for the Siloviki, because they've actually...
You're describing the plot of 1984. I mean, exactly that, the perennial war, isn't it?
Yeah, the Perma War, and the problem is that actually, I mean, and the tragedy is that these sort of men around Putin have actually achieved what many old men, doubtless dream about, but actually very few actually get to execute, which is creating a future that looks exactly like their own past.
To what extent, though, is that going to go with the people? I mean, you and I lived in Moscow. It's flourished since we were there. And in 93, when I was there, I think you were there around the same time. There were no lights, there were no restaurants, the shops were empty. The whole economy was flat on its back. And in the subsequent decades that we spent, you go to Moscow now, it's sort of vibrant city with like excellent food scene and clubs and people with fashion and their own designers and music and everything a modern city should have. With still a lot of problems, of course, but there's a whole generation now of people who don't even remember the tanks on the street. They were babies then, if not born at all. And they've got used to these creature comforts, and they got used to being part of Europe. And if the Siloviki, if these old KGBniks come back in again and take all of that away, is there going to be some protest? People are going to push back, or will they just simply leave? Because at this point, it seems that the ones that don't like it have left, and everybody else is kind of ignoring the war.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, Moscow, people who have not been to Moscow recently, find it unbelievable that actually, when I say that it's literally the most modern, or certainly before the war, the most modern, the most vibrant, the coolest, the most sophisticated city in Europe, like, by a million times, cooler than Berlin, cooler than London. It's true. You actually eat better in Moscow. It's much more functional. They actually had, that enormous, the striking thing when you watch, as I just did, I'm sure you and other viewers have watched Adam Curtis's fantastic Trauma Zone, his documentary series for the BBC. Moscow in the early 90s literally looked like Mogadishu. It was completely disastrous. It was like a third world city, broken pavements, lines of people in terrible clothes. I mean, the transformation is completely extraordinary. That's true. And the really striking thing is, I've been going to Moscow, quite regularly throughout the war. I was last there in September, October, including on September 21st when mobilization happened. So up to that announcement of partial mobilization, Moscow had not noticed at all. Basically, Moscow just didn't care. The war was 100% invisible. I mean, when you scratch the surface and you talk to people in their kitchens, there's all kinds of fundamental problems. The economy is, sagging. There's all sorts of fundamental structural changes that have been brought on by sanctions and so on. But in terms of actual sort of deprivation, my wife is there right now. She says, I came here to sort of suffer and sort of put ashes on my head, and I just sort of find myself in 24 hours being sort of sucked into this sort of Vanity Fair of just sort of fun and coolness. And the shops are still stocked completely with sort of with Parmesan cheese and French wine. And I know, how does that all happen? Nobody knows, but it just happens. Moscow hasn't noticed, and that's it. And that's really significant because for several things. Because obviously, people would wish, watching the sort of horror that's unfolding in Ukrainian cities, it's kind of offensive. It is offensive to think of Muscovites just partying away and not really caring. The vast majority of the middle class in Moscow, I think, are basically sort of secretly appalled, or somewhat appalled, but definitely not appalled enough to blow up their lives, as let's say 500,000 or maybe more, 700,000 have done and left the country. Most people who are either too poor to emigrate or too rich to emigrate, in other words, they've got too much at stake, just muddle on and close their eyes. Those are my friends that have stayed. just say, oh, somehow it's, we're going to get out of this and everything's going to be fine. So, but the point is, going back to Trauma Zone and Adam Curtis in the 90s, we are so far away, like it's still a million miles away from the kind of, deprivation and economic crisis that caused, the protest that collapsed the Soviet Union. We're still a very long way away from that. I mean, and people's heightened expectations might be an accelerator of that. People's expectations at the end of the Soviet Union were very low.
Would you agree then? I mean, that Putin brought, I mean, we were there in Yeltsin's days, and that was chaos. And although he's loved in the West as a democratic reformer, he's hated by the Russians because those 10 years were just, that was the worst of it. And then Putin came, brought stability, and then he started paying 10% wage rises in the public sector every year for a decade. And then we worked it out once. If you take 30 grand as the average American income, then the equivalent of the increase would have taken average wages from $30,000 to 600,000. I mean, that's what it felt like to normal Russians, that suddenly they had the equivalent of 600,000 as an income. And they will take a lot of Putin's crap because they've come so far, they're so comfortable now that for them, the nightmare would be go back to some sort of that chaos that was the 90s. And that has made them very placid. But talking to your friends when you're in Moscow, I mean, the mood there is what? They're ignoring it, or they're mildly disapproving? Because, from where I sit, it sounds like Putin's propaganda is working. And, our staff in Moscow, some of them are talking about leaving because they're now fighting with their friends, because their friends are all so convinced, yeah, we're under attack by NATO. Putin's absolutely right. This is existential, and we have to rally around the flag because we're Russians and we love Mother Russia.
Yeah, that's true. All kinds of really surprising people. He would imagine knew better, suddenly come out as sort of rabid Putinites. It's very strange. The propaganda really does work. I mean, and you're right to actually undermine. I mean, to people who argue that Putin's that people's higher expectations are an accelerator of their desire to change the regime. You can equally plausibly argue, as you just did, that it's the opposite. The fact that people have now something to lose, whereas they didn't at the end of the Soviet Union. They had basically already lost everything. Now that people have to have something to lose, they actually have a stake in the status quo. So the issue for, I mean, in any discussion essentially between a foreigner and a Russian about Russia, whatever the actual metrics of the conversation are, the Westerner will usually be arguing that Russia could be better, and the Russian will answer that things could be worse, and both will be right, by the way, completely. But the thing is, the point is that people actually have, it's not have in recent living memory a very clear trauma, of seeing actually what happens when Democrats take over. They just steal everything. So they'd actually rather have a piece of that.
There's a lovely Russian expression that today is worse than yesterday, but at least it's better than tomorrow. And I think that sums up a lot of the thinking here. Listen, I mean, we're coming into the last quarter. I want to get your view on the big debate in the war now is the motivation that there's one camp, the Vatniks, that believe it's all about NATO and Putin's paranoia about the West, Ukraine specifically joining NATO. And then the other side, dominated by the Ukrainian side, is that it's just Russian imperialism, and that he doesn't see Ukraine as a country, and that he wants to take it back. And NATO is a sort of an excuse for all of that. But I want to put to you, because from my perspective, I do actually think it's largely about NATO. And going through the timeline, it started with Gorbachev being promised in 1990, James Baker, very specific meeting, not 1 inch expand east, and this is all in the historic record. And then all the leaders went on.
I'm not sure about that.
No, well, I can send you the papers, but the declassified documents show that this meeting took place and that promise was made. And Putin, whatever, but Putin himself has brought it up several times. And then that led to the famous Munich Security Conference, where he again alluded to these promises and said, we will push back. And then nothing happened. And then you had the ABM withdrawal, unilateral by the states. And my diplomatic friends at the time who were involved in those conversations said the Kremlin freaked, because that was a major pillar of security from the Cold War era, and the Russians didn't want to see it go. And then that led to 2012, when Putin sacked Kudrin because he objected to the fact that Putin was taking all the money and pouring it into the army. And the modernization then started. That led to 2014, the annexation of Crimea. So, and then on to, you know, the Lavrov speech in 2020, where he laid down new rules of the game. We're not going to do this dual thing anymore, where you sanction us on one hand and buy our gas on the other. You know, it's now all or nothing. Either you stop that and treat us like grown-ups, or we'll break off diplomatic relations. And then that was the beginning of the rise in tensions that led to the ultimatum in December and the 2 rounds in January, February, just before the war. And all of this is, and all of that was about NATO, that it was about security, that Putin feels threatened. And I agree that there was never any serious consideration on the Western side to let Ukraine in, partly because people like Merkel could see that Russia would do something like it's just done. Nevertheless, Putin, people say he's irrational, but if you assume that he thought NATO expansion of Ukraine was inevitable, not necessarily just going to happen now or in 10 years, but that it was inevitable, he sees that as an existential threat to Russia. And so his logic would then become to strike now before everyone's ready, rather than wait to Ukraine eventually joining NATO when it's too late to do anything about it because you've got missiles on the border. So all of that, I mean, I see that as unfolding because I'm watching the story that started in 1990 with the Gorbachev promises, and then ABM, and then the other, you know, open skies. Trump pulled out of two more of those Cold War security deals. And Putin, who made it clear, he usually telegraphs his intentions well in advance. He said very clearly in Munich that, you know, I'm not going to stand for this. And so the whole thing developed over a long time, and him preparing the army to bring us to this point. So that's the NATO argument. And the imperialist side argument, everyone points to that essay that he wrote, 5,000 words, saying Ukraine isn't real, and it's like, you know, Nash, our people. But there's not that much on that side, I think.
No, I mean, so to deal with your points in reverse order, I think that the imperialist argument is wrong. I think, you know, the Estonian prime minister is wrong. I think that people like Radek Sikorski are wrong. That you know, that if we don't stop him here, he's going to take, you know, the Baltics and Poland. I think that's nonsense, because actually the one quote that Putin's most famous quote is, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. People forget the context, or rather the first half of that sentence in November 2005, when he's addressing the Federal Assembly. Putin says, for the millions of Russians who found themselves stranded outside the borders of their homeland, comma, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So, I mean, he is primarily an ethno-nationalist, not an imperialist. And that sounds like just sort of, you know, some, you know, international relations sort of speak, Fugazi. But actually, it's an important distinction, because in that essay as well, if you read it, you know, carefully, he actually says, I respect Ukrainian statehood and traditions and language. The point of that essay is that he doesn't believe that half of Ukrainians are Ukrainian. He thinks they are Russians because they speak Russian. He's an ethno-nationalist. He's not, you know, he thinks the Ukrainians have the right to their own state, or so he claims, but he just doesn't think that they have the rights to rule Russians. That's his logic. So there's about the imperialism thing. But about the NATO thing, I think there's a lot of sort of creative misremembering, because once again, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but people forget that between 2009 and the end of 2014, Ukraine had actually literally ruled itself out of NATO membership. You know, in that sense, you know, Yanukovych had solved the problem, that he had actually, you know, passed a law, and very importantly, I mean, Michael McFaul was present in every single meeting and phone call. You know, it was on every call between Obama and Putin, and according to McFaul, NATO expansion was not mentioned. It was not a major part of Russian dialogue with the US. It just wasn't really on the table. It wasn't. So this whole thing about, you can retrospectively construct this sort of onward march of NATO. But I think the biggest problem with NATO was actually not really sufficiently clearly signaling that actually the Ukrainian membership of NATO was really out of the question, both legally and practically. And that very important summit of Bucharest in 2008, which you rightly mentioned.
Which I was just about to say. That was a key one.
Yes, except it depends how you parse it, because it was a key one in the sense that they actually, Germany said that that they refused a membership action plan. They refused a membership action plan. What they did, they should have communicated, and this is the kind of fatal mistake, recognizing that Georgia and Ukraine would ultimately join in rather dangerously open-ended language. But actually, it was just a communique. I mean, what was actually the result of the conference was they didn't actually move forward with NATO, with Georgia or Ukraine's NATO membership at all.
I had friends who were at that event, and what I was told was that the Americans were pushing very hard for a concrete offer, an invitation with a date on it. And that Merkel and Macron, or whoever is Hollande, I think at the time, resisted that stringently, and they didn't want to have NATO mentioned at all. And the compromise was to this very weak, this very mild, vague invitation. And the German side, in the meantime, regret even doing that, because it just fueled Russian paranoia. But I agree. I mean, I think Putin is paranoid about this question. If it doesn't come up in the bilateral talks, on a day-to-day basis, he is paranoid about that. And the Bucharest one really shook the Russians. They were very, very angry about that. It was a mistake to even offer it. But the instigator there was the States, who were actually pushing for a concrete offer with a date on it. And it didn't happen because the Europeans were trying to find a middle ground and keep the Russians happy, because they're scared of what's just happened.
Right. But the other issue is, if you're sort of constructing, as the Russians do, this sort of the inevitable eastward march of NATO, and you say that the United States was funding the Ukrainian military. Well, that's true, except that there's a major issue with scale. I mean, the whole phone call between Trump and Zelensky, the controversial one in 2019, where Trump essentially tried to blackmail Zelensky. How much money are they talking about? They're talking about $400 million. So the Russians say it's $400 million, but the American military spends $2 billion a day. It's literally like sofa change for the American military. So what the fact that the American military is giving the Ukrainians $400 million a year, by the way, to buy American equipment, which is very expensive, by the way. So it actually is an indication of how unimportant Ukraine is to America, not how important it is. It's literally just, America gives 6 times more to Israel, by the way. But the point is that it's when you're constructing that narrative of inevitable NATO expansion, the fundamental flaw. Sorry,
for Putin, it's inevitable to Putin. I mean, that's the only way I can understand his rationale. That if he believes it's inevitable, then what he does now makes sense. I agree that it was never going to happen, and that if he was rational, he should have just taken the risk and carry on. Because the irony of all of this is that Russia was actually booming in October 2021. I mean, it had made it. There'd just been a dozen IPOs for $1 billion each, and there were 24 more in the pipeline. And all my friends in business, life was going well and flourishing, and they had big plans and expanding into Europe. And he screwed all of that up. Why? It doesn't make sense. He's mad, but he has this irrational fear of NATO expansion.
Well, the thing is, it's actually about much more than NATO expansion, because, and by his lights, it's not irrational. Because if you read, Nikolai Patrushev, his former boss in the KGB, by the way, like high flyer in the KGB, unlike Putin, who was basically fired by the KGB at age 38 as a major. He became a lieutenant colonel on retirement, just as a formality. But anyway, so Nikolai Patrushev actually speaks about this at length, and he gave a long and very terrifying interview where he sets out his worldview. It's not NATO, it's more. Patrushev, and by extension Putin, are totally convinced that the United States is committed to regime change in Moscow. They really believe that, and furthermore cite tons of evidence. He's saying like, oh, this, Democracy Institute and this election monitoring, like, and Patrushev, cites the numbers, apparently, hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent to subvert Russia. So in that sense, actually, not only is Putin paranoid, but Putin is actually receiving what he believes to be concrete information about how the United States is systematically undermining his regime. And in that sense, it's really important to understand that the poisoning of Alexei Navalny in August of 2020 and the Ukraine invasion are part of the same project. It's all about protecting Russia from an assault that's led by the West. And Viktor Zolotov, who's Putin's former chief bodyguard and now head of the Russian National Guard, Zolotov said very significantly, Ukraine doesn't exist. It just happens to be the place where the border between Russia and America lies.
Right.
And that's a very important, that's a crucial insight into their strategic thinking.
Isn't this wrapped up in
really about Ukraine? It's about this sort of supposed superpower struggle, which the Russians think, in their sort of unfortunately deluded way, like a sort of divorced wife that thinks that her ex-husband is like, obsessed with her and like sort of trying to do her down all the time. Whereas actually the ex-husband that literally has forgotten she exists and like doesn't care. And, has got a much more important, relationship with China in this analogy. But, the Russians just are convinced that America is out to get them and destroy them. And this is a defensive war. It's as a preemptive strike against the Americans in order to save Russia. That's really what they think.
I agree. I actually think that that's how they see it. I mean, if you follow this logic with this irrational belief that NATO expansion, then it makes sense to attack now when Ukraine is still weak enough and Russia is now strong enough after that long process of investment into the military and the stability of the Russian economy and the strength of the fiscal fortress. The timing was perfect because those things suddenly were all done, ready, and then Putin strikes, and Lavrov's, new rules of the game speech in February 2020 when Borrell came over from the EU and offering actually to partner with and be more forgiving of Russia, and Lavrov absolutely humiliated him, totally unnecessary. But it was a very clear decision then that, right, we've had enough. And I was about to ask you, isn't this wrapped up in the sort of Russian arrogance that, we're still the equal of the states, we're the other superpower, and they're still recovering from the humiliation of 1991, where they lost that statement. That was deeply painful for Russians. And here Putin is like, we have to have that back, and I'm going to force the issue by taking up arms and to be that superpower, which of course has gone horribly wrong because they're not, as he's discovered.
Yeah, and well, I mean, this you see immediately in all conversations with Russian officials and with Russians in general, actually, that they still somehow believe that they are the peer of America and China, without realizing that the Russian economy is 30 times smaller than the combined economies of NATO, not 3 times smaller. 30 times smaller. I mean, it's Russia's economy is actually smaller than the most European. Than is about the size of Spain's. I mean, it's actually economically insignificant. But what they've done is they've confused the supposed respect that they won back in their region, and with Syria and all these sort of things that do it by sort of pretending to be a great power, and projecting power in Syria, projecting power in the US elections, for instance, which, they were, Rachel Maddow and NBC, portray the Russians as this sort of evil sort of superpower that got Trump elected and so on. If you think that you can behave like a superpower, in other words, intervene in the Middle East and influence American elections, then you do get this that just encourages your folly in actually believing that you can behave like a superpower strategically in terms of and militarily, and that's the core of Putin's error. I mean, he thought that he was as powerful or a contender, and it turns out that he was not.
Yes, as he's discovered to his cost. I mean, we've really nearly run out of time. Just in the last few minutes, could you give us a prognosis of how you think this war is going to end?
Well, I'm very sorry to say that I'm not a military expert, but I have spoken to some people who are. The bottom line is that quantity beats quality at a certain point. Mm. So Russia has such deep resources of manpower and dumb equipment. I mean, almost limitless capacity to source or produce dumb weaponry, that they can actually hold out or even push back Ukraine, superior morale, superior tactics, better army, better leadership, better equipment. All that is true, but at a certain point, those graphs intersect of quantity and quality. If we just throw enough men and enough material at that, Ukrainians will not be able to resist. And unfortunately, I fear that actually the Russian tactic right now, strategy right now, to reverse the vector of the war, to actually have some kind of victory, will actually just prolong it, because in a word, I think the prognosis is that it's going to be a very long and protracted, hard-fought battle, unfortunately.
Yes, no, I agree. Which again, I think is part of the thinking behind the tanks conversation that's going on at the moment, and the West is trying to work out what to do, because they realize, well, I don't know, it's a stalemate at the moment, despite the Ukrainian victories recently. I mean, look, very nice to see you again. Thank you so much for taking the time. That was absolutely fascinating.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Ben. And can you, if you could send me a link, I'd be very grateful.
Of course.
Right.
And to everyone listening, we're going to put this onto our website, bne.eu. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll push it out on social media and the various other platforms we have. So once again, thanks to Owen, and I'll catch you all next time.